My name is Amelia Andersdotter. I work together with Anders Jensen-Urstad at the Swedish NGO, which is a non-governmental organization called Dataskydd.net, which we formed last year in April or May in order to facilitate the enactment in Sweden of the new European data protection regulation. After the kind introduction, I guess you have all of the necessary information on our background, so I don't have to do that. But I thought anyway I would go through some of the rationales behind the data protection regulation, because this is something frequently forgotten in data protection law, that there's a reason that we have these laws. They're justified by legislators and hopefully also by the morals of the common, of the people who are not legislators. And if you keep the principles of the data protection regulation in mind, when you consider data protective measures to help your visitors on your website, I believe it will be much easier for you to see why some particular actions are useful to take and others aren't. So, we have three paradigms for privacy throughout history, but the first one arose in, say, the 1870s in the context of American constitutional law. And it's privacy as the right to be left alone, the right to be secret, not to hand over your data against your will, because we have the knowledge that information about people can be used to incriminate their lives or influence them in ways which they may not desire. So it's the right to stay secret and unrevealed, the right to keep things to yourself. This was replaced in the 1970s by a second paradigm, which is really the one we're mostly currently in, which is the right to privacy as control. So in the right to privacy as control, what happens is, regardless of whether you've let go of your data, you still have the right to reasonable expectation of knowing who collected data from you, for what purpose did they collect data from you, can you stop the influence that they're trying to exert over you with the help of this information that they have. It's essentially a set of rules on transparency and accountability with regards to data collection. So they arose in the context of computerization of public administration. Germany and Sweden were the first countries in the world that enacted data protection legislations in 1972 and 1973. The European Union legislation certainly has been very heavily influenced by these data protection laws from the 1970s. Now, the most recent paradigm for data protection legislation is data protection, or the right to privacy, as a manifestation of the right to identity and identity development, namely the right to know and have transparency and accountability over who collects your information, for what purpose they collect the information, if you can object, and what the information is ultimately used for, is a way to preserve your right to determine not only who you are today, but also who you become. It's the right for you to be yourself and to have knowledge over who you are and how you safeguard your ability to be that person. So the newest paradigm in privacy legislation, I would say, is not thoroughly incorporated in the legislation. I found also a recent development just 2 weeks ago, which is privacy as the right to public goods. So if you have any economists in the audience, they should certainly find that extremely interesting, because that would add another layer of complexity to the privacy problem, which hasn't been there before. But so the right to identity and identity development is sort of in the new EU legislation, in the shape of the right to be forgotten, which is the right also to be forgiven or move beyond your previous mistakes. It's there in stronger rights against profiling, or stronger rights for individuals to object against automatic decision making. So it's kind of slipping into the legislation, but not very quickly. I mean, like many big and overarching laws, for the legal system to adopt new principles, it takes a lot of time. And especially in Sweden, the new European legislative framework, which some of you may have heard of, there's a new data protection regulation which will enter into force on, I think, 26th of April 2018, but let's say May 2018. And so for Sweden, this was a huge challenge when this came into effect, because Sweden pretty much enacted the first data protection law in 1972, and then they stopped caring about it. So we don't have particularly strong, it's not like Germany, where all of the lenders have their own data protection authorities and they take an active role and they're out campaigning in the society. The Swedish Data Protection Authority has been more laid back for the last 10 years. They haven't really done a lot of oversight. our laws aren't really strongly in favor of individuals. We don't have effective sanctions. Pretty much the same problems you would find in many legal frameworks. But at the end of the day, it meant the Swedish public administration and Swedish companies are extremely badly prepared for this new European regulatory framework that has entered into place. So me and Anders thought, having worked together in Brussels on the data protection regulation, that we would use our NGO to find simple, cheap, and quick methods of at least succeeding with some basic problems very quickly that would help the public sector and some companies to get started with implementing data protection rights for individuals. And the result is WebCol. We were currently financed by the Internet Foundation in Sweden to work for 8 months in 2016 on developing a tool by which private individuals can test websites of their own choice for various data protection criteria. You find the URL to our test here. You can check any website of your own choosing, or even your own website or that of your municipality. You can also find the code online, which is nice. It's openly licensed. You can use it for your own purposes if you so desire. In addition, we ran a special project targeting Swedish municipalities. And the reason that we chose to focus on municipalities in particular is a lot of the time online tracking or data collection about individuals is done for advertisement purposes. If some of you are interested in media policy, you will know a lot of the media conglomerates in the world are now struggling to find new revenue streams online. We figured this would be a very complicated problem for us to attack, but at least we can all agree that, you know, public sector institutions, they don't have a commercial incentive to track their users. So if there's a cheap, simple, and effective means of enforcing data protection rights by technical measures on their websites, they shouldn't normally be disinclined to use them. You can find the results of our municipal run here. It's all in Swedish because we targeted municipalities inside of our European member state. But also the code for this is, of course, available freely on GitHub. So you could use it, for instance, to run a similar check on German municipalities. We will move on to talk about some of the technical details. Because I don't have a lot of experience in web development, all of the technical bits of the presentations will be offered by Anders, but it will become hopefully clear to you which one of us is speaking at which time. So this is an example of what our privacy run looked like for the municipalities. We enforced the grading systems of 5 different grades, which is, we believe, the most recent form of grading in Swedish schools. It's changed very often, so it's not easy to keep track. So unfortunately, the grades for all municipalities are dismal. We have 290 municipalities in Sweden, and 217 of them turned out not to be doing anything at all to protect their users against data leakage. At least when we ran this in May of 2016. Now, to our defense, when we ran the same test on August 20th of 2016, it turned out that at least 6 municipalities had been inspired by our advice. We've received some feedback from municipalities in the summer, and now only 204 municipalities have the very lowest of all grades. So there is some form of improvement, and data protection is slowly becoming a part of also web development in the public sector. We're very grateful. We've checked for primarily 3 things, which we will go through in turn. Now, the first thing that we checked when we looked at websites was data leakage to internet service providers, schools, work places, other places that may offer an internet connection to somebody who visits a website. And the reason we check for this is that, of course, all of these network operators, they have huge capabilities to gather a lot of data about individuals in a way which is difficult for the individual to understand. So we thought this would be a good measure of how much a particular website is allowing other people to infer about their behavior, social contacts, or interests without their knowledge. But I will leave over to Anders to talk about the technical details of the tests that we ran and why it's so important that you undertake these simple measures that you can do to protect your visitors from such tracking on your own website.
Right, so let's start with the most obvious thing, which is to use encryption. As you might know, if you use normal and secure HTTP, the traffic is like postcards going back and forth from the client to the server. And traditionally, HTTPS was used for like sensitive stuff only. But increasingly, we would like to borrow the stance of the US CIO Council that everything should be considered private and sensitive, because ultimately it's very subjective what's sensitive. What's sensitive to one person in one context could be a matter of life and death to another person in another context, in another country. And by always using encryption, you don't have to make this judgment call. Also, Nicholas Weaver, a security researcher in the US, had a great talk at a conference in January this year. He was talking about mass surveillance systems and how cheap and easy it is to build your own, and how easy it is to manipulate traffic. And one of his points was that unencrypted traffic is not just information leak, it's actually an attack vector, a vulnerability. If a site doesn't use encryption, you have no idea whether someone manipulated traffic in transit. Or sometimes you do know. I sometimes fly Norwegian, and with their onboard Wi-Fi, they always perform a man-in-the-middle attack to inject some JS and CSS on any unencrypted site that you visit to get their own toolbar. This might seem very harmless, but the point is this is very, very trivial. Very trivial and very scary. Because it could just as well have been someone rewriting a login link on your bank's website, or injecting malicious JavaScript to God knows what. And of course, if you have sufficient capabilities, you can do like China did last year. They injected certain traffic, I think the Byte Analytics JavaScript, and added some code that would just constantly reload 2 specific GitHub pages over and over. And a few million people had this code run on their computers, and they unwittingly became a part of a giant DDoS network. So point being, you have no idea where your users might be or what entities or countries the traffic might pass through. So encryption is always the only option here. Also, if you don't care about security or privacy, you might still want to use encryption, because both Mozilla and the Chrome team have announced their intent to make certain browser features unavailable from non-secure websites. For example, in Chrome, you can no longer use a geolocation API from an insecure website since May, I think. Also, HTTP2, which brings lots of speed benefits, is technically not, the specification doesn't mandate encryption, but all the major browsers vendors have said that they will only support HTTP2 over encrypted connections. So if you want features and speed, you will have to use encryption anyway. And so what you should do then is, of course, go to let'sencrypt.org, the fantastic new certificate authority, which gives out certificates in a free and automated way. It's awesome. It works very well. So yeah, do that.
So we have also looked at data leakage to adjacent websites, which is a peculiar problem that we found, that when you go between different websites, actually the information about what you read and where you've been is forwarded to the other website. Luckily for everyone in the room, there's also a very simple way to not rat out your user to the next link that they click. But I will again leave over to Anders, and this is a really elegant technical method to avoid this problem, so I hope you'll all be inspired by that.
Right, so as you might know, whenever you click on a link on a website or a page loads some external file, the referrer header is sent to the other server. So your browser tells the other server where you came from. So if you visit your local hospital and read about, I don't know, HIV or whatever, and you scroll down and click on the obligatory link to their Facebook page, your browser will tell Facebook exactly where you came from, which is of course a bit scary, and especially since most people have no idea this actually happens. So this is a so-called referrer header in the HTTP protocol. And also it could be like this from, if you go to the American Suicide Prevention website, it will tell, it loads some CSS from bootstrapcdn.com and also tells bootstrapcdn.com that you're reading about suicide, which you might not want bootstrapcdn to know necessarily. And the implementers, well, the people who wrote the specification 20 years ago actually realized this was a problem. They made a note in the RFC for HTTP 1.0 saying, Because the source of a link may be private information or may reveal an otherwise private information source, it is strongly recommended that users be able to select whether or not the refer field is sent. And that did not happen. But there is now a way for website owners to do something about this. It's called refer policy. It lets you specify either via meta tag in your HTML code or via HTTP header a policy that would be applied to all links clicked and all requests generated by the page. So with this one single line you see on top, meta name refer, called it no referrer, it will kill all referrers completely, which is cool because also it's still a draft, but it's supported by all the major browsers, except Explorer. But yeah. So that's a very easy way to make a tangible improvement in privacy in like 10 seconds.
So one important thing to note is that a lot of these measures are disconnected from each other. Maybe some of you will have noticed that the Association for Suicide Prevention, they do use encryption on their website, but they still manage to leak stuff to Bootstrap CDN. So for this reason, we also check with our tool and for the municipalities data leakage to content delivery networks, font providers, text-to-voice services are very common in the public sector to accommodate for people with reading difficulties, and of course to advertisers, which are fairly ubiquitous in the online environment. I will again leave over to Anders to talk about some of the problems or issues that we check for with our tool, and also what you can do to fix the problems if you find them on your website.
So the point is you shouldn't have to protect yourself from the websites that you visit, especially not if it's your local government or municipality. But of course, most websites typically use all kinds of third-party stuff and leak all kinds of data to all kinds of people, with the user typically not being made aware of any of this. But there are ways to not do this. We don't have time to go through all the alternatives for things here. We did compile a list you can find on the address at the bottom. So for example, instead of Google Analytics, you can use pwiki, which is awesome and free, and you can self-host it. Instead of using Google Fonts, you can self-host the fonts. There are some services that will package up the fonts you want in a nice file and generate the proper CSS and so on. And of course, if you still want to use CDNs and Google Fonts or whatever, you can at least still kill the referrers. That does help. Another thing that more people should know about is content security policy, which is a way to, first of it by default it blocks inline JavaScript and CSS, and it basically lets you whitelist approved content sources. So you can instruct the browser that this page can only load CSS from this domain, or only JavaScript from this same domain, or nothing except images. And yeah, it's a very efficient way of dealing with cross-site scripting, and also it's good for preventing accidental information leakage, when you can simply tell the browser what it's allowed to do, where it can load stuff from. And it's a great website called report-uri.io, where you can build these things. It's a nice form, you can click what you want, and it will generate the proper rules. It can be set either in the HTTP header or in a meta tag. Right, so there's a lot of things to think about. So we built this aforementioned website, webcall.dataskydd.net. It basically, when you type address and click check, the front end sends address to the backend. The backend visits and renders the page with Phantom.js, which is headless WebKit, and sends back data to the front end, which then parses and analyzes things and gives some results. It basically simulates what happens when a user with a typical browser with no particular extensions enabled and with do not track not enabled, because it's default. What happens? So I just quickly show you how it looks. It's a website for Süddeutsche Zeitung. They do, it checks for if it uses HTTPS by default, whether refers are leaked, checks for certain third-party services and offers some alternatives. this first-party cookies, third-party cookies, first-party cookies, and third-party requests. They're also categorized thanks to Disconnect's open source tracker list. And it checks for certain useful HTTP headers, like content security policy and strict transport security, which is awesome if you use HTTPS. Also, if you do use HTTPS, you should use HSTS, and also get yourself in the HSTS preload list. So you can. So HSTS is. Oh, yeah, we have time. HSTS is an awesome thing if you use HTTPS. It tells the browser to only load stuff through HTTPS a certain amount of time to prevent certain types of attacks. The problem is when you first visit a website, your browser doesn't know about this, and someone can hijack the connection. So the HSTS preload list is something that the Chromium team runs, where you can submit an address that Chrome will always use HSTS for. So it will only use encryption always and nothing else. It won't allow it if you try to use normal HTTP. And they have a simple page where you can submit your site. I think also Firefox and maybe also Safari uses Chrome's list, so that's a way to secure your website. Oh yeah, and the code for our tool is open source, MIT license. It's on GitHub, but you can try the service yourself on webcall.dataskyddet.net again. It's in both English and Swedish, doesn't use cookies.
Yeah, so this has been the bulk of our work. One thing which can be interesting to note is that if you do leak that, if you're very adamantly opposed to encryption, which you should not be, but if you are, it could be worthwhile noting that the legal protection for users is actually much stronger with respect to internet service providers, at least for now, than it is against advertisers. So when you leak data to an advertiser or a content delivery network, your visitors may not actually have good ways of remedying or finding out what is going on or how they can make it stop or what it means for them. Our organization has done some other work as well. Clearly, data protection is much larger than web front ends. So we've done advocacy with respect to the government. I'm actually at this time awaiting an investigation from the Swedish government relating to identity theft, where they were meant to release it yesterday and I couldn't find it on their website. We've been publishing documents to the government proposing various strategies that they can use to make life more simple for implementers, companies, public sector institutions when they design IT systems or websites. Some of our focal points have been not to make every IT security problem into a crisis. A lot of the things that we find, including security problems in websites, they're normal problems. It's even large newspapers commit these errors. The government in Sweden commits these errors. They're clearly normal situations that need a normal response, such as what we hope we've managed to do, compile simple and easy lists for people to just check off and ensure that they've done what they can.
Also, I can add that the tool only doesn't do any interactions, it just loads the page. That's what happens if you simply load the page.
Yeah.
There are many more things you can think about, if you like, but we just want we want people to start thinking about these things. So, and
you can check deep links, for instance. Sometimes municipalities hide away address or various forms of tracking tools on the kindergarten site, but not on the elderly care site. Why they do this, I don't know. But this is anyway the reality we face. So the other thing is data security and data protection are very similar insofar as in order to uphold data protection for your visitors, you will need to also have data security. You will need to consider security measures on your website. But the reverse is not true. It's possible to violate somebody's privacy in a secure way. So data protection is data security with individuals in focus. It's ensuring that the security measures that you invest time in and undertake are there to ensure the predictability, accountability, and transparency that end users need in order to exercise their right to develop their identities in the way that they want. With those words, our presentation is over. I clicked wrong. You can contact us. You can also check the slides on our website. Some of the information is in English. The links you may find are slightly wrong. They're sort of tailored for a Swedish language audience. But you're very welcome to get in touch with us at any time over the night or even in the future. And we thank you so much for your attention, and we hope this has been very interesting for you. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. At this point, I'd like to invite Anders and Amelia over to the sofa of interrogation, if you don't mind, for some questions. I'm not really going to be horrible. Okay. Careful of the step. I'm still looking at the Twitters with half an eye, so you can tweet Nightly16 with any subsequent questions for Anders and Amelia. Should browsers just not send a referrer by default? Would that be a best practice?
The problem is that many people depend on the referrer for various functions, even though they shouldn't. It's hard to change.
But that would be upsetting some site owners, but preserving lots of privacy.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you could do if you still need referrers is it will be possible to specify a policy that will keep referrers, but only for same domain. So internal links will still have referrers, but external won't. Like third parties won't have referrers. This is in the draft now, but I don't think any browsers implemented yet, but it will be there. So you can at least kill referrers to third parties easily.
So I think one of the problems is that there's been a huge momentum in web development and also in internet standardization at large, where the individual just hasn't been very important when you've made technical standards or when they made this referrer policy document, that they introduce this thing that they know is an obvious flaw, but they think, well, it will work out over time. But then, of course, if 50% of all of the websites in the world suddenly start depending on this, which was known to be a flaw from the beginning, it's going to be very difficult to fix. So there were, in the beginning of the internet's development, when everyone was still excited and doing whatever they could at whatever time, they brought in some failures that don't scale well, that now create a big problem. And we have seen and I know that there was one of Anders' slides that showed that the Internet Engineering Task Force, they're now thinking about these things, but it is difficult to change. I would like to believe that data protection and data security, now that they've become a focus of some of the major standardization organizations in the world, like the World Wide Web Consortium or the IETF and what have you, that this will be kind of the final frontier of web development, that we can still see very cool things going on from the infrastructural level up to the application layer. But it's definitely going to take some time for this development to reshift, for economical reasons, if nothing else.
It's interesting that you mentioned standards that were flawed. And Anders, you mentioned that the geolocation API won't work on non-encrypted connections. And that's really good because the company I work for was co-chair of the working group for geolocation. And it simply never occurred to us that that was a security risk, allowing geolocation to go over HTTP. And we've recently changed it so WebRTC must go over a secured connection as well. And things like service worker must be over HTTPS. So it's good that we're learning. It's just a shame that some of those things are probably going to live forever now. Are there any more you can think of that we should tighten up?
I mean, if you start poking around in internet standards, and especially if you're in the World Wide Web Consortium, there's already this web app security standardization group, which is doing, I think, a lot of good work. And I'm sure there's a host of problems that you, like the do not track standard is now kind of getting reinitiated, perhaps even with European Union more involvement than in the past. So if you were into privacy questions and how not to track individuals, then working with that would be beneficial. How to go from just having the indicator 01 into having something which is a practically useful tool for individuals to not only click on something and hope it works, but also have technical verification that they're not actually being tracked against their will. So there's a host of things that you could look at, and in almost every standard, I'm sure that you will find some form of security problem, right? That you could address, and And I welcome if Opera is engaged in this and willing to look further. I encourage this and applaud your efforts.
Totally are. What do we do, and this is a wider question, but what do we do about people who care about privacy but don't understand the privacy implications of what they do? I saw a W3C lecture a few years ago, and it was a PhD, it was a post-grad researcher working with Tim Berners-Lee, and she'd asked 20 different Facebook users what privacy settings they had, and 0 of them actually had set the stuff they had wanted to set. People had thought about the privacy, but the settings were so obscure or opaque that people hadn't actually got the privacy they wanted. What can we do?
Well, so this is there's a theory in economics called the public goods theory, which originates kind of some of you may have heard of the tragedy of the commons. What happens if you have a pond and everyone wants to fish there, but there's not enough fish, and because they're not coordinating the amount of fish they take out of the pond, eventually all the fish go away and you no longer have an ecosystem in the pond, and it's very bad. So public goods theory is basically about how do you regulate communities that have a common resource, such as fish, in order for them to make the maximal use of it in common. There is a recent movement in privacy scholarship which tries to go towards defining privacy as a public good, in which case the Facebook problem would be reduced to, yes, you don't know what the privacy settings you have are, but also you don't understand the implications, and you may not have the means even to understand the implications of what you're sharing, not only for yourself, but also for others. What happens when I tag somebody because it's fun? Am I having an implication also on their life and on their privacy and the way in which other entities like advertisers treat them? And it's not a trivial problem to solve legally. Certainly our current framework is not really at all, or even our human rights framework isn't treating privacy as a collective right rather than an individual right. In fact, in most European jurisdictions, and I guess also in the US at this time, we've seen privacy as an entirely individual right, as if it's entirely my own responsibility what I sign, how I exercise the rights under the agreements that I sign, and the common utility or the public utility has often been seen as no privacy. We hear this security versus privacy balancing act that needs to be undertaken by governments all the time, where for some reason the lack of privacy and the security of the government always wins. So we're kind of shifting in an anti-direct. It might go back. I mean, privacy scholarship is going to be, and also development in data protection and data security is going to be much more relevant now that the European Union decided that a lack of data protection can actually be backed up by fines. You know, if you're the most immediately big change of the European data protection regulation is that you have fines up to 4% of the annual turnover of companies that do not invest. What we can hope is that it makes companies at the infrastructure level, like device manufacturers, internet service providers, some of the larger platforms like WordPress, Drupal, to invest more time in investigating privacy protection measures. But the legal framework still needs to catch up with this larger with these larger implications of privacy, and especially if it's a public good, we may need to be more inspired even by environmental law than individual rights laws when we regulate privacy in the future. It also, a public goods formulation of the problem would also incidentally mean that it will never be sufficient to have only the market, the invisible hand of the market in some Adam Smith form of way regulating privacy. It means that we would need to have some other form of, additional form of regulatory mechanism to ensure that individuals can both individually and collectively claim their rights to privacy.
Last question is, do you think actually that society is moving into a way that people no longer even expect privacy? I'm the proud owner of 2 teenagers, and they play fast and loose with their own privacy because they believe that privacy is basically an outmoded concept. It would be nice, but it can't exist anymore.
So I don't think privacy is an outdated concept. There's a reason that it's listed in all of the human rights conventions. If we're going to have a democratic society with free opinion making, and where everyone can express themselves, we also need to be able to somehow, as individuals, relate to what ourselves are. So is there a need for privacy to be recast inside of that framework? Well, this is what this identity development paradigm of privacy is about, right? But does it mean that privacy is outdated? No, it doesn't. And there's been tons of studies on how young people deal with privacy online, and most of them do not indicate that young people don't care. It just indicates that they have different means of caring. An Estonian study I know found last year that one of the foremost ways in which young people deal with privacy concerns online is self-censorship. That could be a cause of concern for us. And that, in fact, in a lot of times when people don't care about what data they transmit to lots of third parties online or advertisers or what have you, it's not so much about the fact that they don't care, it's more that they're resigned, they don't know what to do. If I need up to 5 different plugins in my browser to visit my own municipality where I'm a taxpayer, I fund already their activities. They don't need to sell advertisement to have their website up and running, right? And I still need 5 plugins to go there without being tracked involuntarily by actors I cannot see. Then there's something wrong with the way I think we've structured the way that we do web development, and that this is why we're running this project, in the hopes that we will inspire more people to think about visitors. Just because they don't easily express themselves to you, it doesn't mean that they're not there, and only because there is technically the capability to invisibly grab their data, it doesn't mean that it's appropriate to do so. And it's important that we respect also just the normal web visitors that we come in touch with every day.
Thank you very much, both of you. That was really interesting.
Thank you.